Kingship in Judaism, particularly its line of royalty, begins in about biblical times with the first ever Jewish king, King Shaul. Shaul, or Saul in English, was actually a pretty ordinary guy. He was sort of just walking along looking for his father's lost donkeys, so he went to the prophet Shmuel, who told him that he had fulfilled all the necessary signs to become the first ever king of Israel and would be anointed into the position as soon as possible, which kind of came out of nowhere for him. Interestingly, kingship wasn't really supposed to be a thing to begin with, and is initially at least spoken about under a fairly negative lens. The idea was always to place your faith and leadership in entirely with God, and appointing a king over yourselves was seen as a kind of rejection of that. So it wasn't the best of circumstances, but the Jewish people of the time insisted, so that's how it went. So the prophet Shmuel was given some signs as to who he should pick, and as it turns out, Shaul was the guy, which was a surprise to everyone, most of all Shaul, who up until a few hours ago had been running farming-related errands for his father, but now he was king over his entire people, which he was pretty stressed about. In fact, it says that when the time came to present him before the Jewish people as their new leader, he was nowhere to be found, and was later found hiding amongst some baggage. Which kind of gives you a general idea as to where his head was at with this whole entire thing. In fact, later it says that some, quote, scoundrels decided to scorn him and not bring him any gifts, and he pretended not to mind. So it was a bit of a rocky start, but he accepted the role and actually fell into it fairly quickly. Now, it was all during about 1100 BCE, so it was during that period when the Israelites had just finished conquering the land of Israel, but the surrounding nations were none too thrilled about that, so would each spend a lengthy period, usually several decades or longer, trying to make that something which no longer bothered them, which basically meant constant war around Israel for the next few hundred years or so, maybe longer. And this, of course, means a pretty difficult task for the newly appointed king of Israel, which was the elimination of the encroaching Ammonite armies, which Shaul organized and led with miraculous success. So, he was accepted by the common people and favored by God, and everything was great up until Amalek came along. The nation of Amalek was of particular issue, as they were particularly hated by God for a number of historical and religious reasons I'm not getting into here. But the point is, Shaul was ordered to proceed to completely annihilate this nation, just, completely eradicate them, but he kind of messed up in this regard, and instead of immediately executing their king, as he had been ordered, left said king alive just long enough for him to get this woman with child and continue on their line to spawn the likes of Haman from the Purim story and others. So naturally, God got pretty upset with Shaul and decided that he and his line should no longer be king, and it would instead pass on to this shepherd named David. David slew a giant, got accepted into the king's court, got into some serious conflict with the king, eventually resulting in him running away at risk of death by the king and later his armies, but eventually Shaul and all his sons were killed in a war, and David was appointed as the new king of Israel, and the first of his line, which was of the tribe of Yehudah, or Judah, the tribe of royalty and kingship. David fought several wars, including against his own son, Avshalom, when his son and a number of his personal court turned against him and forced him into a violent civil war for a period, but eventually the crown passed onto one of his other sons, King Shlomo, or Solomon. In fact, every single future king would ever after be a direct descendant of King David, and his line never ended. In fact, there are some people alive today who can trace their lineage all along their father's side, straight back to the descendants of King David and then to King David himself, due to the amount of displacement and diaspora that the Jews have gone under for the past few centuries. A lot of people just have no idea about their lineage or even what tribe they're from, in addition to 10 of the tribes of the 12, that is, just going missing at some point. So now the only ones people can be certain about are that of a Kohen, a Levi, and a Yisrael. A Cohen being that you're descended directly from the tribe of Levi back in biblical times, but specifically from Aaron, the Kohen Gadol, and his sons. Then there's the Levi, or the Levite, which means you're descended directly from the tribe of Levi, but not specifically from Aaron. And then there's the third, which is called a Yisrael, which is most people, and basically means you're from the remainder of the 11 tribes. Although most likely from Binyamin, the tribe that Shaul was originally from, or Yehuda, the tribe of King David. As I said, the remaining 10 just kind of vanished, and we don't really know where they are, or who's from them, or what happened with them, but yeah. Although, some people do say that throughout the generations they married back into the line, so whatever. Anyways, lines of kingship. King Shlomo, the son of King David, was great and incredibly wise, and also built the first Jewish temple in Jerusalem, which has incredibly important religious significance, obviously, as it was the main place of worship for the Jewish people towards God, and where the Levium and the Kohanim served, in addition to it being a display of sorts of the Jewish people during that time's might and wealth. In fact, its buildings kind of signified the end of all the wars to secure the region and the safety for the Jewish people for the next few decades or so. Anyways, eventually, when King Shlomo passed, the kingdom was split in two between his two sons in about 797 BCE, and Rehoboam, the first son, ruled over Jerusalem, containing the temple, and the tribes of Binyamin and Yehuda, and Yerovam, the other son, ruled over the remaining 10 tribes in his portion. Yerovam was an idolater and also kind of the worst, so after about 200 years or so, his whole kingdom got destroyed by the Assyrians, which was where these 10 remaining tribes mysteriously vanished. There's a bunch of theories posited as to where they went off to. One of the more interesting suggestions in the Talmud is that they're somewhere behind like a magical river somewhere in that region, but that one's pretty difficult to confirm. Anyways, the other region, however, survived on, and it contained the remaining tribes, Yehuda, Binyamin, and the priesthood, and it was called the land of Judea, after Judah, hence Jew. So, a few more centuries passed, some other kings came and went, some bad, some good, until finally Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians marched on Jerusalem, conquered it, and exiled their king Jeconiah, who was the current king at that time. He had a son, the next king, named Sidkiah, who served as a tributary ruler of sorts toward Nebuchadnezzar, but eventually, a few years later, the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, and the Jews were either killed or exiled, which is where Gedaliah comes in. A lot of the sources are from biblical accounts, a lot are from the historian Josephus, but anyways. Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, a nobleman of some sort, was appointed by Nebuchadnezzar to be the new regional leader. Gedaliah was a good man by all sources, honorable, kind, and righteous, and pragmatic too, trying to make the best of the recently problematic situations by paying the king tributes, sowing and cultivating the land to refertilize it after all the wars and fires, regathering the scattered Jews from the surrounding countries, and providing assistance where it was needed to whoever needed it. And he even managed to get the prophet Yirmiyahu out of prison, where he had been for a while since the wars, so that was pretty cool too. And things were actually going pretty well for once, at least since the destruction and ransacking of the first temple of Jerusalem, and this was mostly thanks to the new king Gedaliah, who on top of being practical and competent, he was, simply put, a good man. Perhaps too good, but that comes later. There was a second person during this period, a guy by the name of Yishmael, a pretty bad person, having, during the siege of Jerusalem a few years prior, had fled the city and defected towards the enemy Ammonite forces. There's not too much about him because, he's not really too good of a person to be talked about, but he seems to be pretty conniving, simply based off the events of the siege. He saw things were falling apart, so fled and switched sides when it was beneficial to him, then proceeding to befriend his once enemies and slowly move up in the ranks until he was a dignitary of sorts. In fact, he himself was descended from the royal family of Yehuda, so I bet looking at Gedaliah on the throne didn't feel too great at him, and he decided he would have his throne through less legitimate means. Now, these two regions where these two men lived got in contact with one another. Gedaliah, mostly oblivious to all of the above information, was thrilled to hear that there was more surviving Jews in the neighboring area, and immediately began inviting them to move into his more centralized region, supplying them with food, defenses, and housing, so long as they, of course, accepted him as their ruler, with Nebuchadnezzar being the technical guy in charge above him. Just pay your taxes, the usual kingly kind of things. So a delegation was sent, as led by this man Yishmael, in honor of the holiday of Rosh Hashanah. A feast was prepared, soldiers and dignitaries and royalty, and of course the king himself, all eagerly awaited the visitation of their neighbors with Yishmael at their head. But Yishmael had different plans, of a more treacherous nature. His new masters, the Ammonites, hadn't sent him and his men as ambassadors, they had been sent as assassins. But a warning was sent to Gedaliah right beforehand. Some other rulers of nearby areas, particularly a man named Yechanan, found out all about Yishmael and his betrayals and plans, and rushed to send messengers to inform Gedaliah, and they arrived in time. Gedaliah read them, but he simply refused to believe them. For whatever reason, he just absolutely would not accept that men who he had promised refuge and safety to, men who were coming as dignitaries, would do something as vile as betray him in his own home. That was just not something he could accept, so he ignored the warnings and proceeded as had been planned. And so, on Rosh Hashanah, the parties met in King Gedaliah's home, him with his retinue, and the others, Yishmael, and 10 other men. It was a joyous feast. There was food and drink, lots of drink, in fact, that eventually everyone, guards and all, had become intoxicated to the point where Yishmael and his men were able to remove hidden daggers and murder every single person in the room, stabbing the king to death in his sleep. In addition, they went on throughout the city that night and murdered sleeping people after the holiday in their homes, and finally the next day, before the news got out, a different retinue of people from a different country had arrived with gifts for Gedaliah in honor of the holiday, so they were invited inside, Yishmael himself putting on a big show of inviting them in, teary-eyed, and then killing them too, before dumping all the bodies into a big pit. And then they left with a ton of prisoners to go back to the Ammonites. However, along the way, Yechanan, the guy who had tried to warn Gedaliah to begin with, heard about Yishmael's atrocities, rallied his forces, and managed to intercept them. They managed to catch up to them and rescue all of the captives, but Yishmael himself escaped back to the Ammonites and survived the whole ordeal, which is basically where things ended. A lot of betrayal, a lot of people murdered, and one king assassinated. The last king, in fact. And with this act, the last hope of a reunified Judea died, and the remaining Jews went finally fully into exile back into the land of Egypt. There, they would remain for a long period before the Persian Empire took over, replacing the Babylonians. The story of the Megillah, the Book of Esther, took place until, with the semi-assistance of King Herod, who has his own entire set of issues, the temple was reestablished as the Second Temple, although nowhere near as great and holy as the first. In fact, this assassination of the king is deemed so tragically important that, according to the Talmud, it's deemed to be as significant as the destruction of the temple itself. He was a good man. He was just too trusting, too naive, and it led to his death, the deaths of plenty of others, and the final full exile of the Jewish people. Not for the first time, and of course it resulted in the death of the last Jewish king. Never since then has there ever been a king instituted over the Jewish people. What was once a great and righteous line of wise and holy men, the likes of which included King David and King Solomon, ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, and not at some battle with sword in hand, but at a feast with a knife in the back. So yeah, never again would there be another king. Never again, at least until the times of Mashiach, which is a fundamental belief in Judaism, that the person Mashiach is said to be a direct descendant of the line of King David. In fact, one of the ways of knowing that the person who will one day claim to be Mashiach is the Mashiach, according to Maimonides, is that there's proof that he is of the direct line of the house of David. So he'll reestablish the Jewish kingship after several thousand years. But until then, and long before, was Gedaliah, Yishmael's betrayal, and eventually the rebuilding of the Second Temple. But the same way that the Babylonians gave way to the Persians, the Persians too would one day give way before a far mightier, far greater empire, the likes of which the world had never seen before. And the same way the first temple over time became the second, and the second would in its own time be destroyed by this new empire, the second temple itself will one day, God willing, be replaced with the third temple, and the final temple with the coming of Mashiach. And that's the whole video. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great night.